All right. Well, let's jump on the line with Michael if we can.
Sure.
Michael in Georgia, he, him. What's on your mind today?
Hey, so actually, it's my question is pretty in line with the subject of morality. Actually, there were some interesting thoughts on it. But what I wanted to call about was, I'm not sure, I don't want to assume, I'm not sure if either of y'all prescribe to this idea, but a sentiment that I've heard watching the show echoed many times is the idea that if God did exist, taking the suppositions of it being a certain God, I wouldn't worship him because he's a monster. I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask was, do either of y'all sympathize or prescribe to that belief?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. I saw in the call notes sort of where you're going. I'm interested to hear you explain it, actually.
Yeah. So I'm an atheist. I deconverted from evangelicalism, but I've had talks with religious people, and that thought's come up before. And I guess my kind of question through those discussions were, when people mention that, if you were to take the presupposition of quote unquote God, wherever that might look like, existing, then he intrinsically is the arbiter of morality. So if that were to happen, which I don't believe in whatever God they're talking about, but if that God were to exist, how could one disagree with that? Because in my mind, intrinsically, that God is the arbiter of morality.
I don't think so. That's divine command theory, and even let's assume for a moment that is true. I wouldn't give a rat's ass. What I would care about is the happiness of the human race. What contributes to the happiness of the human race, the overall happiness, is good, and anything that takes away from that overall human happiness is bad. And some people will use well-being, and I think happiness is something we can actually measure. Harvard's been doing it for 80 years, and we know what makes people happy, and we know what kinds of strategies we need to employ to make people happy. So based on that subjective moral standard, we can look at everything that God has done in the Bible, and assuming that if God's real, then the entire Bible is real, then we can see that God has definitely contributed more to the unhappiness of human beings than he has to the happiness of human beings, which in my mind makes him a moral monster and unworthy of worship. But in general, I'm also not a big fan of worshiping anyone or anything. See previous conversation about worship,
right,
deifying and all that. I just not there. I don't see why I would want to do that. And the fact that God wants to be worshipped, and that is, and Christy, I'm going to kind of veer into your area a little bit. That sounds like a narcissist to me, and I'm not sure that I want to deal with a narcissist at any level. So
yeah, I mean, I appreciate the thought experiment, but in some ways it's like saying, well, what if God wore a blue T-shirt, but it was a red T-shirt? And it's like, okay, so I'm just presupposing for this conversation that there is a God, and that God is the arbiter of all morality. Okay. But then you're trying to get me to go along and say that everything that I have ever understood about how to be kind, how to be decent, how to live a healthy and happy life, and how to promote that among others goes out the window. I mean, I guess I can go along for the ride for the purposes of the thought experiment, but why still? Like, it just doesn't quite come together for me to just imagine that there is that thing, that ultimate absolute morality embedded into the fabric of the universe. Okay, so if you tell me that there is, then I'll go along with it for this experiment, but it doesn't mean anything to me because it's just so preposterous.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Coming from someone who at age 6 had dreams about going to hell, like I totally agree with that kind of being you're definitely giving a lot of ground, but I was just kind of interested in that thought experiment. If you were to temporarily grant that premise, the issue I guess arose for me of granting that premise, I think gives more ground than a lot of people might think. And I was just kind of curious as to y'all's thoughts on that, but
yeah, no, I appreciate you raising it, but I guess the headline from both of us is the God of the Bible is imaginary, comma, that imaginary character is an absolute dick.
Yeah.
Right? Fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it was just an interesting thought, guys, and I was I just had some questions raised by certain statements that people have made before. I'm just curious as to y'all's thoughts on it. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for calling in.
Yep.
You have a great day.
Yeah. You too. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to read a quick super chat from Sean Isherwood, who asks, what do you think of the view that morality is a game theory acting on the level of our genes? I actually think that's a pretty fascinating idea.
Yeah, I think so too. I think one, you need to be, thinking about it, we need to make sure that we're not anthropomorphizing genes, because they're not, there's no will acting on genes, right?
Sure.
They're just doing what genes do. Could you apply game theory to that? Game theory to me implies decision making.
Yeah, okay, I see that.
And so would be difficult at that, I think. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't do it, but that inherent thing of making decision, you take the classic game theory that most people probably, prisoner's dilemma.
Sure.
How do you apply that to genes that aren't making that decision?
Yeah, I mean, whether it is like fundamentally encoded into our DNA, just the notion of morality as a form of game theory of, am I actually helping out of altruism or out of a hope of reciprocity or some like bigger, more grandiose idea of like Ubuntu and us all paying into the same system? I don't know. I mean, you definitely do have opportunities to explore interesting ideas like who's belling the cat if you are in a, in that kind of framework. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really know where to go with it. I just think it's an interesting lens to try and apply.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about it before, so most of what I'm talking about is just off the cuff.
Fair enough.
So if I think about it more, I may come up with some other ideas. But yeah, it is an interesting way to look at things, and game theory is an interesting way to look at things as well.